Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are very excited to celebrate the life and the work of Dr. Jon Henner. And I believe Octavian is going to organize us. I don't see.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon to honor such an amazing human being and a value friend of mine, Jon. First, I want to thank Jon's parents for joining us today. They wanted to say thank you all for coming and showing your support and values for Jon and his life and contributions to this world. I invited his wife, Emily Kerrigan, to join us, and she will be joining us within a few minutes. I was asked to open with a few remarks. Before I proceed, I would like to ask for those of you who are not on the panel or not on the program, please do turn off your camera so that we can have visual access to the interpreters. Thank you so much for doing so. I wanted to open this thinking about Crip Linguistics Manifesto and how that works and how it came to be on how this journal was actually established. Jon and I were friends for a very long time, 20 plus years of friendship. We met at Gallaudet University as undergrad students. And my first impression of him was he was dancing in a public place. He is very experienced with ballet, and he was dancing, and I saw that. And I remember people asking Jon, "You're not worried about what people think of you when you dance in public? You're not worried about what people will say?" And his response was, "Oh, is that what gay people do? Whatever." And they keep going, and he kept going. And that really just showed his subversive nature and who he was. He was a very radical thinker and didn't care of what the world thought of him and moved toward a more valued and inclusive people. We were friends for a very long time, and we had a fortunate opportunity to work in Massachusetts at a university. And when we started working together, we started multiple conversations about what it meant to be signing scholars in an academy that is hostile. And I say this with pure intent here. It was hostile. We were talking about the politics of sign language in higher ed, in academia, and scholarship, and the value of our intellectual contributions on when we think about language, considering language acquisition, and just a multitude of different things. And at the university, we started working on different projects. In our first project together, we never envisioned that this project would actually become what it is today. And it actually became 10 projects. And the 10th project was Crip Linguistics reader book collection that we and Erin, who is also on our panel today, the three of us were the co-editors of that, and hopefully it does release next spring. So we've had a total of 10 projects together. And us as linguists collected all of different thoughts in regards to language, assessments, and attitudes in regards to disability and also language. This paper, we wrote my perspective and also Jon's perspective, and we thought it was time for us to combine both perspectives to set this frame and bring it to light. And we set it up in summer of 2020. And then, of course, coronavirus happened. And then in the fall of that year, we became a little stuck. There was something missing. And luckily, I was co-teaching that semester with Erin. And Erin and I were talking about linguistic anthropology and what that means. And it caused a light bulb moment in my head. We finally pre-printed, but we could not find a journal that was happy to publish this. And the journal that we submitted, in less than 1 hour, they rejected it. If I remember correctly, the editor said our paper was too much theory and not enough data. So I asked Jon, in less than an hour, for them to just determine that it's too much theory and not enough data. So Jon looked at the editor's background, and the editor themselves was pro cochlear implant, pro speech acquisition. So we thought, okay, that's not the best journal to submit to. So we submitted to a second journal and we got a really positive review. But while waiting for that review, we decided sign language linguists, we're preaching to the choir here, and this is an audience that we want. So we thank them for their contribution and their feedback and their time invested, but it wasn't the right fit. So we submitted to a third journal and we waited more than 6 months for that review. And when the review came back and said, oh, but there's too much data and not enough theory, we thought, well, too much, not enough, which one is it? We don't know. So I asked Jon, what do we do from here? And Jon said, oh, he has a new friend named Betty, and we chatted and we'll figure out something. So going from there, I just wanted to ask Emily to join us for a few minutes and have a few remarks in regards to Jon and their work and journey to this published journal. So if you wouldn't mind joining us. Emily, are you here? If you're here, Emily, please do turn on your camera. If not, I will go ahead and allow Betty to talk about your experience and how this article set up the establishment of this journal. I don't see Emily. Go ahead, Betty.
Hi, hopefully Emily will be able to join us shortly. I will pick up the story in where Octavian left off, which is Jon was, I am actually quite honored that you considered me a friend. At that time, I would characterize myself more as a Twitter admirer, that I was always interested in what Jon Henner had to say on Twitter. He was one of the rare Twitter folks whose personalities just shine through, in addition to just the brilliant things that he always left me thinking about. And one of the tweets that really caught my eye was Crip Linguistics couldn't find a home. This preprint, this manuscript that I had been sharing with my students, that was reading with my students. I had also been watching the video that Jon had made introducing Crip Linguistics. It was such a revelation to me, the way of thinking about languaging, through the lens of Crip Linguistics, that I was just floored that it wasn't getting taken up. And around the same time, we were, a group of like-minded folks, all from the, speech, language, and hearing sciences. And I will just be, even more transparent about the positioning of the field, which is speech language pathology, right? And, studying communication disorders. We were the 8 of us. we were having our own struggles finding our place as well, that we were, trained and working in the field of speech language pathology and really struggling with all of the constraints of what it means to pathologize people for their language and languaging, and not finding a place where we can really think beyond that, outside of that, to deconstruct that. And so that's what Crip Linguistics has done for us, is it has given us a language and validation that we really need to rethink the whole thing. And so the Journal of Critical Studies of Communication and Disability grew out of this wish for community and for, for those of us who are finding a very hard time to publish the things that were helping us think together. The journal was created to meet that need and with that intent. And so, as Crip Linguistics would say, there is no such thing as bad languaging, and that's the spirit of the journal as well, is to think about languaging practices as valid in every form, and to really push against the grain that has been dominant in the ways in which communication disabilities has been cast as pathological, as being hyper-medicalized, and the scholarship in the area being very much positivistic. There's very little in the literature that comes from the experiences of those most affected. Very little abidance by the principles of disability justice. In fact, very little knowledge coming in from disability studies or from disability justice at all. And that, of course, is layered and intersecting with all of the other things that we struggle with, which is racism and gender inequities, and a lot of discriminatory things happening under the guise of remediating people's language and languaging practices. And so I sort of, sheepishly, with this very new journal that hadn't actually even published anything yet, I messaged Jon and said, I saw your tweet about you're looking for a home for Crip Linguistics. Would you consider submitting to this new journal that we're getting off the ground? And, not only did he say yes right away, which we were very happy about, but in the next exchange, I also confided that, that we actually really wanted him to be on the editorial board. But he was very also, quite open about all of the things that he was going through in terms of his health. And we were too shy to ask, given that he had been, very busy at that time, tending to his health and his other work. And I said, you sort of dodged, you dodged a bit of a bullet there, because we almost pulled you in on the editorial board. And guess what he said on the very next turn? He said, I'm in. And there it is. The journal really would not be what it is without him and his perspective, his spirit. Just in every way, he really expanded this this project, and we miss him dearly. So in terms of the journal, this is Crip Linguistics Manifesto, is issue 1, volume 1, issue 1, Article 1 of the journal. It is, really kind of our landmark piece. It's also by far the most downloaded. We know the preprint had already been viewed by, so many people, and we're happy that it found a home with the Journal of Critical Studies of Communication Disability, that it continues to be, reaching out to new scholars, and that I think the impact of the article and of Jon's legacy is yet to be seen. I think it is the start of something really, really tremendous. And we're just so proud to have been his colleague for the time that we were honored to. And yeah, so happy that we have the bragging rights to say that the Crip Linguistics Manifesto lives in JCSCD. I don't know if Emily has entered the meeting yet. And if not, maybe we can transition to our panelists. What do you think, Octavian?
Is Jen's audio working now? Is Jen's audio working now?
Sound really faint, Jen.
Octavian said that Emily is here, but should be here, be ready, camera ready in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much for those lovely remarks, Betty, and for telling the audience about how we got to where we are today. Thank you again for also giving a home to the manifesto. I know that Jon was really honored and was really happy to be a part of the journal's inception, and happy to see this continue on as part of his legacy. So again, Emily said that she'll be here in a few minutes. So in terms of the agenda, we could just have her remarks whenever it's a good time for her. And with I say at that point, let's move into the panel where we have 4 scholars with us today talking intersection of social justice and language. And they'll be talking about the Crip Linguistics Manifesto and that framework. We have with us Dr. April Baker-Bell, Dr. RaMonda Horton, Dr. Jenn Phuong, and Dr. Erin Moriarty Harrelson. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've asked each panelist to prepare remarks lasting 7 to 8 minutes about how the Crip Linguistics Manifesto affected their work. With that, I would like to begin.
So are you all seeing my PowerPoint? Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So I too want to thank you all for inviting me to be a participant on this panel in honor of Jon, and also thank the interpreters as well. I want to really just sort of spend some time discussing some highlights from Jon's manifesto, which speaks to the importance of Crip linguistics in transforming the speech, language, and hearing sciences. And I actually am one of the 8 that Betty mentioned in regards to having the opportunity to be able to listen to Jon talk through some of these things related to languaging. And I know that every time we left those meetings and conversations, he gave me something new to think about as it relates to social justice, as it relates to thinking about social justice within the speech, language, and hearing sciences. And so with the manifesto, it really, really provided me with an opportunity to be able to.
I'll be right back.
to be able to reflect on how Crip linguistics really intersects with other social justice frameworks and movements. And there were 3 points that I kept returning back to as I read through the manifesto, as I thought about some of the conversations that were had with Jon in those editorial board meetings. And so those 3 points are going to be the 3 points that I spend some time just sharing my reflections with you on. And they relate to his points about disidentification, care work and languaging, and then this piece on language as being multimodal, and then recognizing that the speaker and a listener cannot be separated from their semiotic environments. Those 3 points kept speaking to me, and they're not necessarily in the order that Jon laid them out in the paper, but this is how I'm going to move forward through my reflection points. And so when we think about disidentification, when I read through the Crip Linguistic Manifesto, Jon made it a point to talk about how important it is to identify with, but not as a member of another marginalized group. And I thought this was so important for those of us who are in speech, language, and hearing sciences, where we do our daily work, working with individuals from a variety of disability communities, that we really start to think about how do we identify with Crip linguistics and recognize how our profession, is implicated in some of the things related to ableism, related to racism, given that disabled communities, those from disabled communities, are our stakeholders. And what I came away with is really sort of thinking about some of the things that Jon talked about as it relates to our discipline being focused in many ways on seeking to fix the disability. And so in some ways, we do uphold and reinforce those standards of normalcy for communication in what Jon referred to as ideas about disordered languaging. And so within the context of our discipline, so much of what we do is based on standardization, based on norming. And so in order to identify with Crip linguistics, it would mean possibly rethinking or even abandoning certain notions related to normalcy. And so that we wouldn't simply be in our discipline talking about recognizing differences and how to accommodate those differences, but we'd also be working to deconstruct and reconceptualize really what it is our role is in providing service delivery to those from disabled communities. And in thinking about that, that might really sort of mean letting go of that gold standard of normal language. And as a child language person, the gold standard is the one that we're always talking about. How do we get there? But when we think about that gold standard, we're really sort of committing to this belief in an ideal, homogenized population of communicators, when in fact we know that there is a lot of variation as it relates to communication, as it relates to how communication is acquired and developed. And so in some ways, Stockman and Hyder have talked about how variation has really sort of been, our field has tried to minimize it when we think about that gold standard. But when we talk about norming and we talk about that gold standard, I wonder if what we're really doing is making it so that no matter what, people will always require or need our services, even when they don't require them to live rich and fulfilling lives. And so part of that piece related to thinking about normalcy and the gold standard, I think would really help to address how do we identify with, but not as a member of another marginalized group. When we're chasing that gold standard, when we're remaining inflexible about that gold standard, in some ways, we're making it impossible to really foster a community or society that can adapt to a variety of speakers and situations. The second point that came up in Crip Linguistics that I reflected on and kept coming back to was Jon's point about care work and languaging. And Jon Manifesto does encourage us to engage in what he refers to as that care work, where we are calibrating to each other to seek mutual understanding. And really one of the really major points that stood out for me with this particular point was that mutual understanding requires work on the part of all interactants, and that's going to be speakers and listener. Okay. And so I do wonder how much growth and transformation our field would experience if we do seek to understand some of the context and constraints for communication that are based on the realities of everyday systems like racism and ableism. I think that a true understanding of these contexts and constraints would mean that there is a greater focus on the development of research frameworks, of interventions and programming that study the listener, that study how the race or the ability of the listener impacts perception of accented English, of stuttering. And so I think if we also begin to study communication behaviors of neurotypicals, how the race or ability of the communication partner impacts perceptions of social functioning, we might be coming up with some new information related to what can we do in our discipline to help transform what happens for those populations that we serve. If we begin to study those ideologies and contexts for communication, for literacy, with this understanding of care work, we might also be able to begin to really move the needle on some transformative approaches that will help address justice and inequity as it relates to racism and ableism. The third point that I think I want to just mention a few reflections that I came away with as it relates to the manifesto. Jon talked about the fact that the user and listener cannot be separated from their environment. That language is multimodal. And so if we think about the fact that communication is a vehicle for knowledge distribution and consumption, then one of the things that we also have to recognize is that by not acknowledging multimodality of languaging actually reinforces inequity. We need to remember that communication and knowledge have been used, as Dr. Baker Bell talked about, to situate and maintain power for dominant groups. And so historically, knowledge and participation in society, in democratic processes, has been withheld from marginalized groups through the privileging of written expression within US culture. We can't ignore that. And when we think about that as it relates to race and languaging, we can see historical precedents for that when we think about some of the nuanced kinds of things that happened over time in the US, how language was used or how communication was used to withhold knowledge through written expression for our slave ancestors, how literally in the US for many years, Blacks in our country were barred from participating in the democratic process using particular measures related to written expression, and then how these kinds of withholding of knowledge through written expression really was designed to sort of tear away at Black folks, I'll say, self-determination, ability to determine and move forward and progress and benefit in the same way that others in this country have benefited. And so even though today we know that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities have access to reading and writing instruction, one of the things that I always come back to, and I think Jon's manifesto was very helpful in really helping me to think about this, is that those underlying frameworks for a racialized bimodal expressive system that situates and maintains power for white mainstream American English speakers remains in place. And it's why we still have some inequities. Even whose linguistic system is valued is based upon whether or not some form of the written expression exists. And so I do see that there is shared history, shared struggles that could unite and help build coalition for eliminating racist and ableist structures. We could make some of the same critiques in thinking about oral and written systems as it relates to those from various disabled communities where communication and languaging are not necessarily oral or written. How historically, in various disciplines, including the speech, language, and hearing sciences, the emphasis has been on the acquisition and proficiency of oral and written expression of communication. That verbal ability was a representation of cognition and intellect, and that to not be able to speak meant that one was judged to be intellectually inferior. Our society functioned from an ableist orientation of withholding knowledge and also barring human rights and participation in basic aspects of living and giving little consideration to disabled folks' own self-determination as well. And so that underlying framework of a bimodal system that situates and maintains power for those who are able, again, it still remains intact. And so one of the ways that we began to really sort of build coalition is to recognize those shared histories and shared struggles, really start to think about how and when we can begin to look at and understand whether or not there are alternatives for looking at communities, for looking at how communication is practiced, for looking at this disordering of language that tends to reproduce inequity. And so I appreciate Jon's work as it relates to this Crip Linguistics Manifesto. I appreciate all of the conversations and really having the opportunity to be able to learn from him and his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horton, for those remarks. I am with you on some of my favorite points about disidentification and language care work. The whole notion of linguistic care work was originally inspired by a conversation that we had with Dr. Moriarty. So I think that this actually serves as a very nice segue to our next panelist, Dr. Erin Moriarty. Dr. Moriarty, would you please join us on camera? Hi. Let me see if I can pull up my slides. And like you, Dr. Horton, I have not used Zoom in quite some time, so I'm going to see if I can figure this out. Okay. Okay, so today I will be talking about cripping linguistics from translanguaging to calibration. And in that, I will share my journey as a researcher and how various ideas really have built upon each other, which is one of the things that I have been so inspired about regarding this work, which is how all of our thinking seems to have become more shared. I think we all knew that something was wrong with our respective fields, whether it be linguistics or speech language pathology. So that's one of the things that I really loved about Jon, is that he really was the best kind of troublemaker. That's actually how I met him, on Twitter, much like others, or others here today anyway. And I do have to admit that our relationship didn't exactly get off to the most, well, I should just say I did not think that we would ever turn into friends or colleagues that shared a mutual respect, because we really got into it on Twitter. But again, he made a good kind of trouble because he made us think differently. And I was really struck by how both Jon and Octavian were able to pull from various things that all of us have certainly thought about for years and assemble them into a singular framework that really resonates with so many people in a way that makes us say this and of course. I'll start by telling you a bit about how it all began, which is with my own dissertation fieldwork, which I am an anthropologist. My dissertation work was done in Cambodia. And my intrigue with Cambodia arose from seeing how different NGOs had various conceptualizations of deaf people in Cambodia. So they would enter Cambodia after the genocide and as the nation was rebuilding itself. And NGOs often described the deaf community as being non-existent in Cambodia, saying that there was no shared sign language, deaf people had not engaged in schooling, and in short, deaf people did not have any language. So that justified various approaches that they took. And one approach was to import ASL, American Sign Language, into their schools. Another NGO tried to invigorate the use of a Cambodian Sign Language. And I sort of, in working with them, rode mopeds to rural areas to where they knew that deaf people lived and where they were looking for other deaf people, and then would bring these deaf people to a school in the city center. And the deaf people were often described as not having had any language. I would observe the approaches of these NGOs and what they repeatedly said about the deaf Cambodians and how they described the deaf Cambodians' thoughts in their interviews. So having no language is still a descriptor that you see even in recent publications, yet I saw firsthand deaf people communicating quite skillfully using various resources, whether it be pointing, drawing, using emojis, whatever tools were available. There certainly was a rich ability to language. So that was my field work for my dissertation. And then more recently, I did work in Indonesia where I focused on deaf tourism, in which I observed different encounters between deaf people from outside of Indonesia engaging with deaf tour guides from Indonesia. And what I often noticed was a use of the calibration of the various signs that they used. So calibrating really served as a metaphor for the whole existence of deaf people. Deaf people worldwide that I've come across, be it at conferences or in my field work experiences, often talk about this linguistic calibration that we do. And what is meant by it, of course, depends on each context and situation, but effectively, we're talking about navigating between different resources and modalities, using space, imitation, using facial gestures, and incorporating what is known to that person of different sign languages, spoken languages, forms of written language, mouthing, finger spelling. And if the individual does not have a shared language with the person they're interacting with, or does not know a written language, they will use their phone or other resources. They draw. They also are able to sort of copy the gestures of their interactant, indicating that they're able to embody language from those that they're interacting with as a way of achieving understanding and communication between themselves and their interlocutor. If a sign that they use is not understood, then you see that they readily switch to using a different form of communication that they see as understood. So it is an ongoing iterative process, calibration is, and is a form of languaging and care work, as Drs. Henner and Robinson have said. So these exchanges that are really built upon both people using calibration indicates that once they have a shared understanding of a point of reference, then they will move into whatever it is they have to say about the topic. So this is also a question of morality, because each person is working to make sure that the other person understands. And it is a collective effort to ensure mutual understanding. It's been fascinating to watch that sort of process play out every time, even without a shared sign language or a shared written language. So also a driving interest of mine is language ideology. I'd like to understand, so a common through line of my work is language ideology and seeking to understand what people think and believe about language, or what their views are of language. And researching that is really important to be able to unpack ideologies of power and political relationships. As you've seen from previous panelists, it is clear that some are marginalized on the basis of their language or made to feel inferior because their forms of languaging don't fit the norm. And language ideologies are so impactful on all people, not just deaf people, but various populations, because then you also have various services that, yes, apply to deaf and hard of hearing people, but as well as hearing people, both on the basis of class, race, and ethnicity, because you have various types of intervention services, including speech therapy or the use of auditory aids, accent reduction therapies or approaches, which I understand that some in attendance today do work on. So these ideologies shape real people's real lives and can be very dangerous, because it can lead to situations where people start to believe that they are an inferior human. And when you are a people that is described as having no language, that is truly dehumanizing, which is an experience that deaf people have had time immemorial. Be it through different forms of methods or strategies attempting to impose hearingness or even English onto deaf people. One example is signed exact English, which is a contrived form of signing that is not a true language unto itself, yet schools readily adopted these practices as a form of changing the languaging of deaf people, and it is not strictly limited to those who are deaf, but these sorts of practices can be seen in stories experienced by people who don't adhere to the white norms. White able-bodied norms. My work also focuses a great deal on this no language trope, which again is widely used in various contexts, but particularly the Global South. It is often used in various contexts. There was a film that I was just showing in class the other day. What is the name of it? the exact title is escaping me. Oh, A Life Without Words. It's about 2 deaf children in Nicaragua. And it's so interesting how the film characterizes both people as having a life without words, which is extremely reductive and an oversimplification of a very complicated situation. It also reveals hierarchies between what is considered real language, what is not viewed as language. And again, I feel like I do need to be cautious here because I am not making the point that I'm not making the point that language doesn't need to be attended to, because deaf people do experience language deprivation, and that is a real experience for deaf people who have lifelong consequences of language deprivation of the early years. Yet, it is unfair to characterize people as having no language. It is simply that their language practices might look different, that perhaps they're employing gestures or using home signs among those in their home or community. So all of the data that I have collected, oh my gosh, for about 10 years now in the field, amounts to recognizing the fact that deaf people calibrate their language, and this is a form of language care work. And I think that's one thing that still needs to be worked on further, which is who does the calibration and for whom. Why aren't people talking more about the teachers or the power holders or the powerful people as the ones who should be doing the calibration and seeking to interact in different ways? Instead, the onus falls on deaf people to do the calibration, to meet the needs and levels of understanding of the adults in their environment. So there's a fine line that we do have to walk, where you don't want to say anything goes, because that is what leads to situations of language deprivation. Yet at the same time, you also want to recognize that every person, every individual is different, and we have different ways of languaging. I don't think I need to go through these points. I feel like effectively I'm preaching to the choir here. So suffice it to say that people use various ways of languaging, different modalities, and mixture of opportunities. As Jon said, your language is the story of your life. The thing that I do really love about that line, that your language is the story of your life, is that it applies on so many measures that are used today. For example, the ASL proficiency interview, the ASLPI, which is used to evaluate somebody's ASL proficiency. The best score is a 5. My score consistently is ranked at 3, even though I've been signing since I was about 10 months old. So I learned signed exact English when I was an infant. And I was told repeatedly that my ASL was not good throughout my childhood into adolescence. So it is interesting how systems are used in different ways against people regardless of who you are. So among deaf people, you are often viewed as being not Englishy enough or being too English. And so that's one of the reasons why Jon's quote resonates with me so deeply, that your language is the story of your life. My language reflects various ideologies around deaf educational methods that were present in my life from birth. And with that, I'll say, Jon, thank you for that validation wherever you are. And again, he is the best kind of troublemaker. We should all aspire to be a little bit more like Jon. Octavian? Thank you so much, Erin. I love that. Jon was the best kind of troublemaker. I would love to be more like him, but I think that is impossible. With that, we will turn to our final panelist, Jenn Phuong. Dr. Phuong?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, it's afternoon for everyone now, at least if you're in the US, I guess. I'm going to share an access copy of my remarks in the chat. So if you want to follow along, you can feel free to do so. I do not have slides today. And so thank you so much for having me on this panel. My name is Jenn Phuong. I use she, her pronouns, and my access needs are met at this time. I'm going to share a bit about myself, first to explain how I came to Crip Linguistics, and then focus on how I use it in my teaching. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Swarthmore College, where I primarily work with general education teacher candidates and teach the requisite classes related to emergent bilinguals and special education. My research and writing examines the intersection of race, language, and disability in US schooling, and exploring anti-racist and anti-ableist abolitionist and disability justice approaches to education in multilingual and multimodal spaces. And so I was actually a high school English language arts special education teacher for 6 years in Brooklyn, New York. And sometimes I actually feel embarrassed about how I entered this field. I had experiences with linguistic minoritization growing up in the US as the oldest daughter of Southeast Asian genocide and war survivors. And so I actually wanted to become certified to teach English as a second language, or ESL, through the New York City Teaching Fellows Program. However, the program decided not to offer the ESL program that year, and so I was funneled into special education because of my degree in French studies and linguistics. And during that time, I worked with many students who were classified as English learners and disabled, and the structures that shaped their educational experiences confounded me. It wasn't until I started graduate school that I learned more critical ways of understanding language and disability, which I did not have access to in my teacher training. And so when I work with undergraduate teacher candidates now, I often think about what I wish I had known when I was teaching secondary school. And now I try to incorporate Crip Linguistics in all my classes. And I will say in the last year and a half that I've included it, the Crip Linguistics Manifesto specifically, my students have loved it. I use it as an opportunity in class to have students think critically about the role of language and communication, but also to introduce students to critical lenses on disability, such as teaching about the term Crip, or challenging the idea that disability can only be considered in special education spaces and not education writ large. I also use it in my Educating Emergent Bilinguals class as a way to highlight sign languages and multimodal ways of communication. Without considering all modes and ways of communicating, we cannot truly understand the nature of linguistic justice and linguistic oppression. To that end, it's also served as an excellent entry point into critical perspectives on the field of linguistics itself, and actually forces us to really sit with the fallibility of theory. And so trying to take Crip Linguistics into the field of education is difficult, especially as the field itself is divided in how disability is addressed, with even further subdivisions. And in some ways, thinking about Crip Linguistics in schools is antithetical to disability justice, as schools are an extension of the state. However, Bell Hooks argued that the classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. And so I think Crip Linguistics is a beautiful entry point into thinking about disability justice, and for myself, transformative justice, and how those values can be brought into schooling spaces. Like many of you have already shared, I also met Jon on Twitter. We had the opportunity to work together on a couple things, including a panel at the 2023 American Association of Applied Linguistics Conference on linguistic care work. He and Octavian Robinson define linguistic care work as, quote, how disabled people work together to co-construct meaning. And they further state, linguistic care work embraces interdependence between languages as a practice of collective access and desire to work toward mutual understanding. just introducing the disability justice principles of collective access and interdependence already offers so many ways of practicing disability justice through the way we interact with one another. And so for me, that really aligns with transformative justice in thinking about how we can shift our everyday little practices. And so right after I defended my dissertation, whenever Jon emailed me, he called me Doc. It was such a tiny gesture, and I don't know that he knew this at the time, but he very much contributed to me learning to own my degree and be comfortable with myself and the fact that I earned a doctorate. And so my activist crush named Grace Lee Boggs wrote, "Transform yourself to transform the world." Crip Linguistics has taught me that all ways of languaging are valuable, and that includes my own. And so I believe that Crip Linguistics requires us to ask ourselves, what happens when we value our own ways of communicating? While Crip Linguistics builds from deaf and autistic scholarship in particular, it's helped me think about my own disabilities. I was never classified as having a disability in school, but later in life, I learned that I'd had lifelong depression and anxiety in addition to complex PTSD. That, on top of getting long COVID a couple years ago, has impacted how I relate to my own speech and communication. Words don't always appear on a page or tumble out my mouth like I intended. Lectures can be littered with pauses, and sometimes I even experience a freeze response when I've realized I've forgotten what I said. But I also tell my students at the beginning of the semester that if they remind me what I was talking about, I'm usually able to get it back, or that I might not look at them when I'm speaking, but taking notes helps me be more present and a better educator. We can have conversations about collective access, interdependence, and care work. We can close the classroom doors so that the hallway noise doesn't cause sensory overload. We can avoid wearing fragrances and understand that needs change over time, and that oral communication is not the only way to communicate and does not need to be privileged in a classroom. And so for me, Crip Linguistics is not only a framework for thinking about language, but for practicing and using it across all spaces. And so I just want to thank you to Jon and Octavian as well for offering us this framework and a lot to think about and start practicing disability justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Phuong. Thank you, Doc, actually. All right, so we have about 13 minutes left for today. I wanted to have and mention two things before we go over to a general Q&A session for the panelists and also other folks who are involved. First, brief remarks from Emily Kerrigan, who is Jon's wife. Emily, if you wouldn't mind coming on screen for us now. Hi. Did you want to say a few words about Jon and his work and the so much work that has gone into getting this linguistic approach published?
Yeah.
This is Emily.
I know I was slated to present before the panel, but I think it actually worked out wonderfully to be able to hear all of the perspectives that each panelist shared about how the Crip Linguistics Manifesto influenced their work.
Right.
So the publication process was a long one and arduous. I know that there was a great deal of struggle, lots of submissions, resubmissions, and rejections. And honestly, I only heard a little bit each time about the submission. So whether it was accepted or rejected, and of course I saw Jon's frustrations about wanting these ideas to be out there in the world. I think this is kind of embarrassing, but it's, oh, John, correction to the interpretation, John would have been embarrassed at the level of attention that he's getting today, but would have loved how much people are interacting with his ideas. I think from the beginning, when I first met John, I knew that he really strongly advocated for justice in various forms. I'm looking up to my top left, by the way, because there's a picture of John right there. So it's like, I'm gonna say these things about you, okay? Talking to him. And he never lost that passion for justice and for really deeply engaging with people on Twitter, or whether it be via Twitter or his academic publications. You know, I'm also thinking I want to leave time for others who are with us today on the Zoom. So I think just know that wherever he is pleased with this, and in the next universe, I'm certain that his ideas, well, right now, John is in the next universe. And I know that he is happy with how his work has been received in this one.
I agree. John's commitment to justice itself is unwavering. From the first time I met John in 2000 something here at Gallaudet as an undergrad, he was walking around on a motorcycle and trying to impress people and get some friends, but also at the same time, he was very aware about what was right and what needed to be valued in terms of justice. I remember when we started working at Holy Cross, he said, "Oh, you should become a bodybuilder. You got the body for it." And I told him, I said, "Yeah, but I'm scared to go to the gym. I'm not comfortable changing in the locker room as a trans individual." And John's response was, "Well, I'll go with you. I'll make sure you're okay." So we started going to the gym together. And at the gym, that's actually where our first idea for a publication happened, because we were arguing, does science have a solution for language deprivation, or does humanities have a solution for language deprivation? And I'm a historian, and I said, of course humanities has the answer, because we have the language and vision and attitude of why people think this way. So that actually became our first paper, and that paper became 10 projects in total. So it's really one of the greatest honors to work closely with John. So thank you so much for joining us today, Emily, and everybody as well. So before we keep going, we do have one more person who would like to make a 2-minute remark. We have our journal editor, Reen, would like to say a few words in regards to our next issue. Reen, if you wouldn't mind coming on camera.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending today. It's really celebration of John's life and legacy, but for me, it's also clear that we're celebrating a community that he helped build together through his troublemaking character. I love troublemakers, so I'm very happy that I got a chance to work with him. Following the Crip Linguistics framework, and in that spirit, I would like to share with you that the Journal of Critical Study of Communication and Disability is sharing a call for papers for a special issue dedicated to exploring the intricate, often overlooked intersection of genocide, communication, and disability. The special issue aims to challenge the perception of genocide as a peripheral concern for academics, practitioners, and community groups engaged in communication and disability studies, and to expand our knowledge and the discourse within and between genocide, communication, and disability area of studies. Today, we had 2 presentations, Dr. Erin, and I'm sorry, I'm blacking out with the name of the last presenter as well, who mentioned how genocide interacts with our communication and disability and development. With the adoption of Genocide Convention in 1948 following the Holocaust, the international community pledged to prevent such horrors, yet the world has witnessed the failure to prevent genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Myanmar, Sudan, Rwanda, and currently in Gaza, making this topic timely and urgent. We invite submissions on genocide, communication, and disability, ranging from original research, case studies, fieldwork analysis, to critical reviews, book critiques, and reflective essays. This issue aspires to disrupt traditional narratives and offers a comprehensive examination of genocide's impact on communication practices and the lived realities of disabled individuals. Manuscripts will be accepted starting May 15 on a rolling basis. Each submission will undergo a rigorous peer review process, ensuring rapid feedback and the opportunity for a revision. We are committed to maintaining our editorial standards and look forward to publishing this issue by December 2024. Please support us in our mission. The mission of the journal, just to remind everybody, is to advance an open access interdisciplinary platform that rigorously contests positivist and colonial epistemologies while striving to dismantle the traditional discourses and ideologies. Our mission encompasses a broad spectrum of scholarly inquiry aimed at amplifying the narratives of those marginalized and pathologized for their unique languaging and communicative practices. It is with this ethos that we embark on curating a special issue that seeks to eliminate the critical nexus between genocidal acts, the communication barriers and opportunities that arise from them, and the lived experiences of disabled persons caught in the crossfire of history's most egregious crimes against humanity. Thank you again for joining our special event today, and we hope that you will contribute to our mission by either sharing your work with this special issue or sharing the message with those who might be interested in publishing in this special issue. Thank you, Octavian.
Thank you, Reem. And thank you to everybody for participating today. I had hoped to have a little bit of time for folks to have some remarks in regards to their memories of Jon, but unfortunately we're down to the last 4 minutes. I would like to encourage all of you to go ahead and type some things in the chat box, and also all of you turn on your cameras to say hello and really see the community that Jon built through his work and also through Twitter. Hello, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you will be submitting to that special issue, hopefully this fall, and more going forward.
I said thank you so much. Erin is also saying thank you.
All right, it seems like a lot of folks are coming off. I am going to sign off myself. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Octavian.
Farewell from me. That was from Erin.
And thank you to our wonderful interpreters, Jenn Phuong and Josh Anderson. Thank you.
Eddie and the rest of the team, that RaMonda, Reem. This was beautiful. Thank you for giving us this space. Thank you. And anyone else who I didn't mention who was amazing.
Jen, I want to say I'm sorry I blanked on your name like in a second.
Oh, no worries. It happens.
I'm so bad with names. I like forget my kids' names sometimes and I start like it's really bad for like really, really bad. But my son graduated from Swarthmore, so
It's definitely a very intellectual space.
Very interesting place, yeah. He was there at the time when they were